Good morning. I'm reading from Rays of the One Light. These are weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, written by Swami Kriyananda and based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Deeds versus intentions. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. Jesus Christ emphasized repeatedly the spirit, not the letter of the law. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, he speaks of the sin of killing and of the legal punishment attendant on that sin, but says that more important than the act is the desire to kill or to do harm. He shows that the sin of harmful desire goes beyond merely wanting to kill. My message to you, he said, is this: whoever is angry with his brother without cause already stands condemned. Whoever contemptuously calls his brother a fool shall answer for it to the Supreme Council, and whoever calls his brother an outcast of God shall be in danger of hellfire. Brother here Jesus refers to as any other human being. For all of us in the highest sense are brothers and sisters, children of our one Father, Mother, God. The true self of one is the self of all. To hurt another is, even if one doesn't realize it, to hurt oneself. Swami Kriyananda in The Path recalls an episode in which the master, Paramahansa Yogananda, revealed his sense of identity even with the plants. One day, Kriyananda wrote, we were moving a delicate but rather heavy tropical plant into position on the hillside. Our handling evidently was too rough, for Master cried out, "Be careful what you are doing. Can't you feel? It's alive." To wish death to anyone, to wish even harm to another creature, is to deny in oneself the reality of that divine life of which all of us are manifestations. It is, in short, to deny the eternal truth proclaimed by the Bhagavad Gita. This self is never born, nor does it perish. Once existing, it cannot ever cease to be. It is birthless, eternal, changeless, ever itself. It is not slain when the body is slain. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. About one today. So this question of being angry at our brother is something that we all need to think about and be aware of. The teachings tell us that if we harbor anger towards anyone for any reason, we still have a long way to go on the spiritual path, which is a humbling thought. Next time we're in terrible traffic and somebody cuts us off, even those little irritations, that anger that rises up, we have to calm that. There's a beautiful story that Yogananda tells of a policeman in India long ago who was chasing a robber and going through in and out of alleys and streets and kind of lost track of him for a moment. The only weapon the policeman had was an axe. And he was chasing this robber. And then he came out onto a street and he saw a man walking down the street, and he called out. He thought he was the robber. And the man didn't turn around or stopped. He just kept walking. And so the policeman was, in this adrenaline rush of chasing this bad person. He came up behind the man, shouting to turn around. Still the man just kept calmly walking. So the policeman chopped at him with his axe, cut off his arm completely. That got the man's attention. He turned around. He was a sadhu. And he said, "I'm not the one you're looking for." He calmly reached down, took his arm off the ground, reattached it instantly. He had yogic powers, obviously. And the policeman felt terrible. He just hurt a holy man. But the sadhu said, "Don't worry, the one you are seeking is in such and such a place." That's an example of divine calmness, divine forgiveness, divine patience. It may not be where we feel like we are today, but it's where we are headed. To have that kind of patience, compassion for everyone, no matter what the situation. I had a sweet little story I'll share with you. When we were just starting Ananda's work in Europe, we had at our disposal a beautiful villa in the mountains beyond Lake Como. The only trouble was that it was a summer villa, and we were there in the winter. I remember having to play the harmonium with gloves on. It was so cold. But one day, a friend of mine who was also living there, Patricia, we heard this blood-curdling cry, and we just didn't know what to make of it. And it was so cold up where we were, it was called Valio, that little town, that everybody left in the winter. They even took their chickens with them. There was nobody and nothing left. So we heard this blood-curdling cry, and we started looking around for what it was. And next door, backed into a corner, was a little kitten. And its fur was all fluffed out, and he was just hissing and spitting and so upset. We tried to get close to him, and he ran into a bush. And Patricia went back while I kept an eye on where he was, and she wrapped her arm in a towel so she wouldn't get too scratched up. And she reached in. This little guy is just fuming and spitting and scratching. She reached up, got him, and she put him right in my arms. And the little guy, instead of scratching more, the little guy just went, "Oh, thank God." And we took him home, and he was our first Ananda Europa cat, and even made the journey to Assisi when we all moved down there sometime later. But I've always remembered that, because usually when people are spitting and scratching and howling, there's a cry for help there. And it reminds me of another strange story in my own life of when this was years before I came to Ananda, and I was going to a job interview. And I had never talked to this man who was interviewing me, not on the phone or anything. But I walked into his office, and he started screaming. And he didn't know me from anybody. I knew I was blameless. That was a good thing that I knew. I'd never seen this man before, and he was screaming at me, so I knew it wasn't my fault. And so I just was not that affected by it, and I started observing him. He was wearing a suit, so his whole body was covered except his hands, his neck, and his face. And I realized that he was covered with boils. Now, whether the anger caused the boils or the boils caused the anger, I don't know, but he had good reason to be upset. And so I just tried to be very soothing. And I don't remember if he offered me the job or not, but I certainly didn't take it. Either way, didn't want to be around that. But whether we see the physical boils or not, they're there. Something has happened to make people angry and upset. And we can either have a knee-jerk reaction and just go, oh yeah, well, let's just fight about it. Or we can go into our center and have compassion. Now, which do you think is the higher path? Let's try to have that compassion for everyone and everything. We don't know what people are going through, what they've suffered, what their nerve endings are like that's making them upset. But if we multiply it, it's not going to help anything. So when Yogananda talked about that that plant, can I have the hot water? Sorry, it's allergy season. When he was talking about that plant, he was urging us to realize our oneness with everything. Like the Festival of Light says, you are a part of all that is. So if we can take this beautiful season of spring that's upon us and enjoy the flowering plants, the birds singing, all of it, just echoing that surge of new life and energy. If we can, instead of viewing it as though it's all on the outside, instead think of it as being part of ourselves, that expands our awareness. It's a very good, very good exercise. So I think I'll stop here so you don't have to suffer through more of this.
So I'll read a short passage from Whispers from Eternity by Paramhansa Yogananda. Veils surround me, Father, hiding thee from me. I love the dainty colored veils of roses and daisies, the shining veils of clouds of burning gold, the dark star-decked shawl of the night. But how long wilt thou remain hidden behind all these veils? I love them because they hint at thy presence, yet they still hide thee. I long to see thee as thou art, behind all this cover of veils. Yesterday, Carmenza sent us photos of the tulips out here in the orchard that have just come up. And so after service, on your way to the car, be sure to look at them and enjoy them. Veil or no veil, they're beautiful. And this topic of deeds versus intentions is an interesting one. And it's a little challenging in a sense to tease out, because Christ is saying if you intend to hurt someone, you've basically already hurt them. You just haven't done it outwardly. In Autobiography of a Yogi, Sri Yukteswar challenged Yogananda on this point because Yogananda was about to swat a mosquito that was on his arm, and he stopped. And because he remembered, ahimsa, non-injury, I'm not supposed to hurt things. Sri Yukteswar said, well, why didn't you finish the job? And he said, sir, you intended to kill it. Why didn't you go ahead and do it? And he said, well, I understood that it was incorrect. And then they have this whole elaborate discussion about how it's not practical to practice ahimsa perfectly in this world, because if we're driving down the road, we may kill a bug on the windshield or whatever. We may step on something unknowingly, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's impossible or impractical to practice it flawlessly in this world. But it is possible to weed out the intention to do harm. And that's kind of the continental divide, where the energy either goes downhill or the energy goes uphill towards the light, downhill into delusion and involvement, and uphill towards freedom and divine light. And what we have to realize, again, this goes back to the topic from last week, we are children of the light. We are not children of darkness. And it's all too easy to think that we are, because we've sort of been given this message through more than a century of civilization, from basically the 20th century, and maybe a little before that even. The message was, look, we're just animals, okay? I remember somebody trying to make that point, some kind of scientist making that point to Swamiji, and his response was, speak for yourself. It's kind of interesting. But if you think about it, I started reading a book recently that my mother recommended me, and I haven't read far enough into it to give a wholehearted recommendation of it, but I like where it's headed. The book is called Humankind, and it's human. I mean, it sounds like an insanely broad topic, but what it's basically saying, as far as I can tell, is that at our base, we are in fact kind. And the book goes on to prove this point through example after example after example. And the first example that comes up in the book is stories from the Second World War. And so London is getting bombed, and it's the beginning of that phase of the war. And the assumption is that people are going to go nuts. People are going to absolutely lose it, because their home is getting bombed, and their way of life is getting totally disrupted. The kids all got moved out to the country where it was safer. And in fact, that did not happen. And then the assumption was, oh, well, that's just the English, because they're, stiff upper lip, blah, blah, blah. There were a couple of really sweet examples of responses to this from the store owners, who had either part or all of their business destroyed. One of the businesses put the sign on the front door, which was still there, but much of the building was destroyed. We're more open than usual. and another one said, this is a tavern or a pub, I guess, and the sign said, "We've lost our windows, but our spirits are excellent. Come in and try them." I thought that's just... But, kids were still playing in the street. Yes, they were sort of dodging the piles of rubble. People were still riding their bicycles and disobeying the law. The policemen were still out there directing traffic as best they could. And people generally helped one another and tried to muddle along through it. And I remember this. Now this is a sort of a ridiculous comparison, but it was one little example of this. When we first moved to India with Swamiji in 2003, we settled in a large home and in a nice neighborhood, and it was a beautiful home, but it was completely empty. And one of the things that we learned is that the power in that particular neighborhood and that area went off irregularly and frequently. And you couldn't really tell how long it was going to be off for. And, we just had to deal with that. Well, I mean, eventually we dealt with that by getting a battery backup and by getting a generator to charge the battery backup and, this whole elaborate system. Well, when we got there, we didn't have that. And so we'd be sitting having a satsang or a meal or a whatever in the living room talking, and the lights would go off. And, and if there was a fan on, the fan would go off. I mean, it's just absolute dark. You're just sitting there in the dark. And initially, that was like, there'd be this pause, and it's everybody start fumbling around looking for flashlights and candles and phones and whatever. And eventually it was like the conversation did not stop. You just kept on moving. And that's what we saw in the Second World War with England, and later with Germany and the bombings that happened in Germany as well, which were brutal. In fact, they ended up deciding. See, this referred back to a book. There was a very seminal book on this subject, basically saying that people are uncivilized in their nature. And this is a French book that came out in the late 1800s, and it became very influential. And Mussolini read it, and Hitler read it, and Stalin read it, and even Churchill read it, just to understand what it was. And basically, the idea was if you put enough pressure on people, they will crack and they'll go nuts. Therefore, let's bomb the heck out of London, and people, they'll lose their spirit essentially. Well, they didn't, and all the evidence was to the contrary, but people had made up their minds, no, it must be so. It's reasonable, therefore it must be so. Well, it wasn't so. And we have to learn, and this is the example that Swamiji is giving us from this chapter. Basically, he's saying, watch your thoughts. Watch the way your energy is running. Watch your intention. Because that's ultimately what will manifest in action. And if you catch it while it's a thought or an intention, and of course there's a spectrum of reality. I mentioned the continental divide. That's the spot where if a raindrop falls an inch or two on one side of it, it'll head down towards the Mississippi. And if it falls on the other side, it'll head towards the Rio Grande or wherever, ultimately towards the Pacific Ocean. And, once it gets going, once it's got a little head of steam and it's part of a little rivulet or a stream, it's going to start moving pretty vigorously in that direction. Well, so it is with our own thoughts. They get a little momentum behind them, and we don't really want to walk it back up the hill. Because it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, it's like we start thinking, okay, well, I guess it's got to be that way. He did that to me, therefore I've got to be angry with him, or I've got to respond. I've got to teach him a lesson. And we ignore the fact that we don't own this world personally, but we are connected with all of it. I was thinking recently, as a number of us have been doing, we were working on collecting firewood for the next winter up at the new retreat that we've gotten up in the hills towards the Somerset area. And I squashed my thumb, between a log and a hard place a few weeks ago, enough that I lost the thumbnail. And, which is not a real fun experience. I mean, it caused me to have to sit down for a few minutes. I can't say that I necessarily responded as even-mindedly as the sadhu Nirmala was talking about, who lost his arm and, reached down and picked it up and stuck it back in. But I also realized at the moment that, it's going to take a couple of weeks for this to not be any big deal. And it might take a couple of months before my thumbnail finally comes completely back. But do I therefore punish my other thumbnail because it's still there? I mean, it's like we're connected. We're all of us connected. In fact, we could do a visualization of, imagine that every person in this world, all however 7 billion or whatever it is, every person is connected with every other. And think of the network. If you could graph that out, it would be this unbelievable mesh of consciousness and connectedness. And we are. And we're connected with all the microorganisms and all the whales and birds and trees. And I mean, we're connected with all of it. And we have the job is to help take care of it and to be supportive and be nurturing and loving and all of that. And it's easy to forget that we don't own it. We're just here for a while. I read recently that one of the major technology hardware producers is thinking of going to a subscription model, which would mean that you don't buy your phone. You essentially lease your phone. And initially my thought was, well, I don't know about that. I mean, I sort of like just going and buying the thing and then I own it and, it's mine to use. But then I got to thinking, in a sense, that's kind of a more Dwapara Yuga, age of energy way of looking at things. Because in fact, if you think about it, so you own your home, let's just say. You bought it, you paid for it, you have the deed that says so, you can say so to your neighbors, you have the choice of what you do with the inside of your home, etc., etc. Well, do you really own it? I mean, in 50 or 100 years, assuming the neighborhood is still here, assuming the home is still here, you may be long gone by that point. I mean, we don't even own our own bodies. Yes, we use them, but in a sense, it's all on rent. It's all on lease. And we have to choose, what kind of experience am I renting for? What am I looking for in that period of time? Whether I own it or whether I lease it, whether I think of it in those formal terms or I don't. Nevertheless, it's here for a time and then it's gone. And Christ is saying, look to the eternal. Look to the deepest part of the connections that we all share. And the Bhagavad Gita is saying the same thing. Look beyond all this movement at the surface, that beautiful affirmation that we practice. I am neither the ripples at the surface of the sea, nor yet the crashing waves. If you think about it, our own bodies are the outside of our bodies are like the surface of the sea, where the senses are engaged in the world, which is perfectly fine. That's what senses are supposed to do. They're supposed to guide us through the world so we don't fall, we don't get burned, we don't tip over or crash into something. That's all good and well. But if we remain hypnotized by the senses permanently, we're missing the higher, deeper potential, which is to pull back from the senses once in a while and experience the ocean deeps that are unaffected by any superficial change. That's where our nature is, and that's how we are children of the light. And yes, during a war, and here we have one going on in Europe now, yes, there's all kinds of disaster and commotion going on. It's very easy to get swept up in that, caught up in that. But that we are not the darkness. We have the potential to identify with the darkness, but we are not the darkness. We are the light. And so let's not only affirm our unity with that light, let's actually realize our oneness with that light. That is our destiny, our nature, our potential. And if we explore it, or to the degree that we explore it, we will know the purpose of our lives to be the expression of divine joy. In the purification this morning, in the fire ceremony rather, I was mentioning that the equinox just went by a week ago, and so we're just in the dawn of our year. The sun has just risen, it's just above the horizon of our year in a sense, and we have sort of the day ahead of us, all the way from now until the equinox in the fall, when evening comes to the year. Well, in the daytime of our year, we get more engaged in outward activity. It's perfectly natural, it's perfectly normal, but we have to remember to bring divine consciousness into it. Because then our deeds will match our intentions, and our intentions will be true and uplifted in the divine light. So let's carry the inner light that we've experienced in meditation, in inward prayer and devotion. Let's carry that into our outward activity during this time period and feel God's grace flowing through our hands and our hearts to everyone. Namaste.